Think about the last time you worked harder on something and got worse results. Not because you were distracted or dropped the ball, but because you genuinely pushed further and things actually got worse. That feeling has a name, and it goes deeper than you realize. And I think you'll find it highly relevant given today's climate. Here is what this video is actually about. There is a pattern operating inside your work, your organizations, your technology, and your habits. And most people never see it until it has already done significant damage. The pattern is this: the things designed to improve your life will eventually begin working against you if you let them cross a certain line. More effort produces poorer work. More technology creates deeper dependency. More management produces less control. More help can quietly reduce your ability to help yourself. We are taught the opposite of this. We are told that desirable inputs have a simple, reliable relationship with results. More effort means more success, right? More tools save more time. More professional oversight creates more control. And when results disappoint us, our instinct is almost always to add more of whatever we were already doing. That instinct is exactly what Illich's law is about. The philosopher Ivan Illich argued that past a certain threshold, adding more does not merely help less. It begins actively damaging the very result you were trying to produce. The curve does not just flatten, it bends downward. And the most uncomfortable part of his argument is not the economics of it. It is what it reveals about us, about why we keep crossing the line, even when we can see it coming. Illich was an Austrian priest, philosopher, and sociologist who spent his career doing something most intellectuals avoid. He challenged the institutions that everyone around him agreed were obviously good. He challenged modern technology, the education system, and standardized healthcare. He proposed the idea of a convivial tool, one that allows its user to exercise genuine autonomy and creativity. He drew a contrast between those tools and the tools of industrial society, which had gone beyond their original goal and become destructive to human autonomy. His deeper argument, developed in books like Tools for Conviviality and Medical Nemesis, was that institutions like schools, hospitals, and businesses are necessary and functional until they reach a certain threshold when their conviviality is lost and they become bureaucratic and technocratic, mired in complexity and the perverse need to develop self-sustaining but otherwise counterproductive expert knowledge. I'll provide links to both of those books in the description below. Illich said, instead of being means to help human achievement, these institutions become an end, and humans become the means. Instead of freeing us, our tools begin enslaving us. That is the real claim. And it is uncomfortable because it applies not just to governments and hospitals and school systems, it applies to your calendar, your inbox, your fitness routine, your productivity stack, your management style, your relationship with your own ambition. So I thought we'd walk through 3 stages of how this works, then examine 7 specific truths about human nature that Illich's law exposes. Then we'll finish with a practical method you can use immediately to find your own threshold before reality finds it for you. The main mission of this channel is not just to uncover and study the patterns that thinkers have discovered in human nature. It is to assimilate them in your everyday lives. If you're anything like me, you'll find them not only helpful in cutting through all of today's clutter and chaos, but equally helpful in helping you find success, and most importantly, peace of mind. We could all use some of that right now. First, let's talk about the mechanics. Illich identified 2 thresholds in the development of any tool, which he called the 2 watersheds. We can think of it as 3 stages. Stage 1 is productive. Additional effort creates meaningful improvement. A road connects communities that were isolated. A school helps a child learn something they could not have discovered alone. A doctor treats an infection that would have been fatal without intervention. At this stage, more input and more improvement move together, and the relationship is real. Stage 2 is diminishing returns, which we've all heard of. Additional input still helps, but each new unit helps less. Another meeting provides a little clarification. Another hour at the desk produces a little more work. Another software platform solves a slightly narrower problem. The curve is still moving in the right direction. just more slowly. Most people recognize this stage. They just assume it means they need to be more efficient, not that they should stop. Stage three is counterproductivity. Institutions cross a threshold into counterproductivity, a condition in which they get in their own way and defeat their own purposes. Meetings prevent work from happening. More and more aspects of life are seen as needing intervention. But at the base, these are caused by entirely different problems. Productivity systems become another full-time job to maintain, right? The tool that was supposed to serve you now requires you to serve it. There is a threshold beyond which the value of a tool or institution is jeopardized, beyond which what had been good and useful becomes counterproductive and destructive. The ordinary law of diminishing returns says that more produces progressively less. Illich's more unsettling insight is that more can eventually become negative. And the reason we repeatedly cross this threshold is not simply poor planning. It exposes several things about human beings that we would rather not admit. With those stages out of the way, let's talk about Illich's 7 truths. Here's the first one. We are much better at seeing effort than evaluating effectiveness. Hours, activity, messages, reports, and visible strain are easy to observe and easy to measure. But things like judgment, restraint, timing, and clarity are much harder to measure, so they receive far less credit. Think about how this plays out in practice. The employee who stays until 8 in the evening appears more committed than the employee who solved the problem by 3 and went home. The parent who schedules 7 structured activities appears more involved than the parent who simply protects their child's unstructured afternoon. The creator who publishes constantly appears more serious than the creator who waits until there is something genuinely worth saying. In every one of these cases, the visible version of effort gets rewarded and the more effective version gets quietly penalized. And this is not just a personal psychology problem. Think about how performance reviews actually work in most organizations. Managers are asked to evaluate people they see for maybe a few hours a week. So, what gets evaluated, what is visible, who sends the most emails, who is in the most meetings, who responds fastest, who looks the busiest. The person who does genuinely sharp, focused work in a shorter window and then stops is often invisible to that kind of evaluation because their output looks effortless, even when it is not. The system is not rewarding productivity. It is rewarding the performance of productivity, and those two things are not the same. The psychological tension here is real. Stopping feels morally suspicious. We associate exhaustion with deserving success. Busyness becomes evidence that we are responsible, necessary, and important. So eventually, we are not working to produce a result. We are working to prove that we are the kind of person who works. The output is almost secondary. Organizations reinforce this constantly because genuine contribution is genuinely difficult to evaluate. So they reward what they can see: unnecessary emails, elaborate presentations, meetings that exist primarily to demonstrate involvement. Employees learn quickly that creating visible activity is often safer than producing invisible but meaningful work. And once enough people in a system learn that lesson, the whole culture shifts. Busyness becomes the currency. Slowing down becomes a liability. And the organization has now crossed its own threshold because it is spending enormous energy producing the appearance of productivity rather than productivity itself. The fix is simple but uncomfortable. Replace "how hard did I work" with 3 different questions. What actually changed because I worked? Which part of today produced the real result? And what could disappear entirely without affecting the outcome? Now, here is where it gets harder, because even if you understand the first truth intellectually, there is a second truth that makes it almost impossible to act on. We cannot feel the threshold while we are crossing it. Counterproductivity does not announce itself. There is no alarm when focused effort becomes exhausted repetition. The change is gradual, which makes it almost impossible to interpret correctly in the moment. There is also a lag problem. We often receive feedback long after the damage has already occurred. Fatigue can appear hours before we notice the mistakes it is causing. Burnout develops slowly, quietly, over months, long before someone finally becomes unable to function. Or this one. A relationship can deteriorate for years while both people insist they are sacrificing for the family. Think about what this looks like from the inside. You sense a growing distance between you and someone you love. Conversations feel strained, affection becomes less natural, and being together starts to feel like work. You assume the relationship needs more effort, so you try harder. You plan more time together, ask more questions, offer more advice, and push for deeper conversations. But your attention begins to feel like pressure. Small disagreements become larger because neither person has enough emotional space to recover. The harder you try to create closeness, the more the other person withdraws. You interpret that withdrawal as proof that you must try even harder. And at every step in that loop, the diagnosis feels correct. More effort feels like the loving response, even when the effort itself has become part of the problem. The problem is that the diagnosis is wrong, because the issue is not the relationship or love. The issue is that you crossed the threshold 3 weeks ago and have been compounding the cost ever since. And there is a cruel illusion built into Illich's spiral. As performance declines, tasks start taking longer. Because they take longer, we conclude that we need to work more. More work creates more fatigue. More fatigue creates more errors. More errors create more corrective work. The spiral is self-reinforcing, and at every point in the loop, the logical response feels like doing more, which is exactly the wrong response. So instead of waiting for collapse, watch the leading indicators. Repeated mistakes, increased irritability, reading the same paragraph 3 times, conversations that become unnecessarily adversarial over small things. Or how about this one? Difficulty choosing between simple options. These are not always signals to push harder. They may be evidence that you crossed the threshold a while ago and have been compounding the damage ever since. Now, here is where it gets politically uncomfortable, because the third truth is not about individuals. It is about what happens when a system has been running long enough that people's identities depend on it. We've talked on this channel before about when an idea or belief becomes attached with your sense of identity. Once we invest in a system, we protect it from reality. Human beings do not judge systems impartially when their money, status, or sense of self is tied to those systems. When a system stops working, its beneficiaries do not typically say, "This system has failed." They say, "This system needs more resources." Watch how this unfolds institutionally. A failing process receives more oversight. More oversight requires more documentation. More documentation requires more administrators. The expanding administrative burden is then presented as evidence that the problem is highly complex, which justifies even more administration. The system is not solving the original problem anymore. It is solving the problem of justifying its own existence. This is related to our video on Parkinson's Law, which I'll link to at the end of this video. This dynamic shows up in almost every large organization you have ever worked in or dealt with. Think about the last time a major initiative failed at a company. The response was rarely to step back and ask whether the initiative itself was the problem. The response was almost always a review process, a committee, a new layer of reporting, a consultant brought in to assess what went wrong, and then a recommendation for a slightly modified version of the same initiative with more oversight attached. The system did not shrink in response to failure. It grew, and the growth was presented as the solution. In business, this looks like the expensive platform that employees struggle to use. Instead of removing it, the organization buys additional integrations, training programs, consultants, reporting tools, and eventually a second platform to organize the first one. The original decision becomes politically impossible to reverse because reversing it would mean admitting that the people who championed it were wrong. Sunk costs become emotional. Admitting that a system has become harmful means admitting you misjudged it, that you wasted resources, and possibly that your expertise is no longer needed. It is psychologically much easier to demand another intervention than to accept that the intervention itself was the problem. The test for this is what I call the zero history question. Ask yourself, if this system did not already exist, knowing what we know now, would we create it? If the answer is no, then history may be the only thing keeping it alive. We are roughly halfway through, but just wanted to mention real quick. If you're finding this useful so far, please take a moment to hit the like button and subscribe. It's a small gesture, but it helps this channel reach more people who are trying to recognize the hidden patterns shaping their lives. Moving onward. Truth 4 is about the relationship between people and their tools, and it is one Illich felt most urgently about. He proposed the idea of a convivial tool, one which allows its user to exercise their human autonomy and creativity. A good tool helps you accomplish your purpose. A counterproductive tool gradually changes your purpose to accommodate itself. Look at how this has played out. Email was supposed to accelerate communication. Many workers now organize their entire day around managing email. Social media was supposed to help people share their experiences, but now, experiences are increasingly designed to be shared on social media, which is a different thing entirely. Productivity software was supposed to organize work. Teams now perform work so it can be represented properly inside the software's dashboards. Our tools become too complex and fail to serve their original purpose. Instead of being means to help human achievement, they become an end, and humans become the means. And this is worth sitting with for a second because it is subtle enough that most people miss it entirely. The question is not just whether a tool is useful. The question is whether using it is making you more capable or less. A hammer makes you better at driving nails. A navigation app, used constantly, can make you worse at navigating without it. A calculator is useful, but someone who cannot do rough mental arithmetic anymore because they have always had a calculator nearby has lost something real. The tool did not just help, it quietly replaced a capacity that used to belong to the person. This point hits hard for me. I literally don't know anyone's phone number anymore, including my own. I'm looking at you, Apple iPhone. In Tools for Conviviality, Illich offered a simple proposition. People need new tools to work with, rather than tools that work for them. That distinction sounds small, but it is actually enormous. A tool that works for you is doing the job. A tool you work with is extending what you can do. One builds dependency, the other builds capability, and once a tool has crossed into the dependency category, opting out becomes genuinely costly, which is exactly what Illich warned about. There is a sharper version of this warning in his work. Beyond a certain threshold, things like more, bigger, and faster simply become counterproductive and then destructive. A tool becomes socially dangerous when participation is no longer meaningfully optional. Again, looking at you, Mr. Apple iPhone. When the person who refuses the tool can no longer fully participate in work or society, convenience has hardened into dependency. You are no longer using the tool. The tool is using you. The quick test for this is 4 questions. What human ability does this tool strengthen? What ability does it quietly weaken? What new obligation did it create that did not exist before? And could we still function if it disappeared tomorrow? Truth 5 is about measurement, and it is one of the most insidious patterns in this entire framework. We optimize what we can measure and sacrifice what we cannot. Numbers create the appearance of objectivity. Once a measure becomes dominant, the unmeasured parts of life start to look unreal, or at least unimportant. Education becomes reliant on test performance rather than intellectual development. Health becomes laboratory values rather than the actual experience of being well. Work becomes completed tasks rather than meaningful progress. Parenting becomes opportunities provided rather than the relationship experienced. And, as I remind myself every day, a YouTube channel can become all about views, retention, and subscriber counts rather than whether an idea genuinely changed how someone sees the world. The reason this happens is not that people are cynical. Most of the time, the people choosing the metric genuinely believe it represents the thing they care about. A school administrator who pushes hard on test scores is not trying to destroy curiosity. They are trying to demonstrate that learning is happening in a way that can be reported and defended. The problem is that the proxy and the real thing are only loosely connected. And when you optimize the proxy hard enough, the connection between them breaks entirely. You end up with students who are very good at tests and have no interest in learning, and both outcomes happened at the same time, through the same system, with the same good intentions. While we've mentioned Goodhart's Law previously on this channel, I do have a full video coming out on it soon. It delves deeper into the idea of metrics becoming the goal. Illich defined iatrogenesis, which is usually used to mean illness caused by some medical treatment, in three forms: clinical, social, and cultural. And these three forms create a self-reinforcing loop of negative institutional feedback. The same loop appears in any institution that optimizes a proxy measure hard enough. The metric improves while the mission quietly fails. Here's a clean example. A customer service team reduces average call time. The metric looks great, but customers have to call back because their problems were not actually solved. The department becomes more efficient at completing calls and less effective at helping customers. The measurement succeeded. The purpose failed. The practical fix is to pair every important metric with a damage metric: speed paired with error rate, output paired with rework, revenue paired with customer retention, number of meetings paired with uninterrupted working time, content volume paired with audience trust. The damage metric does not eliminate the primary one. It just stops the primary metric from lying to you. Now, truth 6 is where this moves from professional life into something more personal. And this is the one I think most people feel, but rarely say out loud. We use productivity to avoid more difficult questions. Busyness is not merely an economic behavior. It can be a psychological refuge. A full schedule protects us from questions that have no reassuring metric. Is this work actually meaningful? Am I still useful here? Do I actually like the life this success is creating? What am I neglecting while claiming to provide for it? There is a version of this that almost every high-achieving person has experienced, but rarely talks about. You are in the middle of a genuinely productive stretch. Things are going well by every external measure, and somewhere underneath all of it, there is a quiet discomfort you cannot quite name. So you add more to the schedule. Another project, another commitment, another goal. And it works, temporarily, because a full calendar does not leave much room for uncomfortable questions. The busyness is not just output, it is insulation. This shows up most painfully in family life. We often sacrifice time with the people we love in order to provide them with things that are supposed to express love. We work for the family, but become progressively absent from family life. Past the threshold, provision begins consuming the relationship it was supposed to protect. And the painful irony is that the person doing this usually knows it. They can feel it. But the alternative, slowing down and sitting with what that time would actually reveal, feels harder than just keeping the pace. Seneca, the famous Stoic philosopher in Rome, noticed something like this 2,000 years ago. His observation was that life is not necessarily short. Much of it is simply squandered. The important question is not whether your time was occupied. It is whether the occupation deserved the time. He was writing to a friend, Lucilius, who had finally retired after decades of demanding work, and his point was essentially this: you spent your life being busy, but busy at whose request and toward whose ends? That question is just as uncomfortable now as it was then. I'll link to this book in the description if you're interested. It's actually somewhat comforting to read firsthand how people grappled with the same problems that consume us today. The practical move here is to separate instrumental activity from terminal value. Work is usually a means. Status is usually a means. Money is usually a means. They are supposed to serve something else, something that actually matters to you. The question worth sitting with is whether the means has begun consuming the end it was supposed to serve. And that brings us to the last truth. If we do not choose a limit, reality will choose one for us. Modern culture treats limits as failures of imagination. We assume that every constraint can be overcome with enough effort, enough technology, or enough management. But natural systems survive partly because they contain limits: sleep, seasons, scarcity, recovery, attention. The body's need to rest. These are not design flaws. They are stabilizing mechanisms, not our failure to find a solution. The refusal to stop does not eliminate the limit. It changes the form in which the limit arrives. Refuse sleep, and the limit returns as cognitive failure. Refuse rest, and it returns as burnout. Refuse organizational simplicity, and the limit returns as bureaucracy that nobody can navigate. Refuse time with family, and the limit may return as estrangement. Refuse maintenance, and the limit returns as breakdown. What is interesting about this is that the limit always arrives. The only variable is whether you chose it or it was imposed on you. A person who deliberately builds recovery into their schedule is making the same concession to human limitation as someone who collapses from exhaustion, but one of them is making the concession on their own terms, at a time and in a form that they can actually work with. The other is having the limit enforced by their body or their relationships or their organization, and by that point, the cost is usually much higher than it needed to be. Healthy organizations understand this. They create deliberate constraints, meeting-free blocks of time, limits on how many projects can run simultaneously, small decision-making teams, sunset dates for policies and software that no longer serve their purpose, required recovery after intense periods of work. The mature organization does not merely ask how to grow. It asks which forms of growth would destroy the qualities responsible for its success in the first place. Properly chosen limits do not reduce productivity. They protect productivity from turning against itself. That is the difference between a constraint imposed by exhaustion and a constraint chosen by judgment. And the organizations and individuals who understand this tend to sustain high performance over long periods, while the ones who treat every limit as an obstacle to overcome tend to produce intense bursts followed by expensive recoveries, or no recovery at all. So now let us make this practical. Here is a 5-part audit you can run on any system in your life, whether that is a work process, a habit, a technology, a relationship structure, or your own schedule. Step 1. Define the real outcome. Not work harder or be more productive. The actual human result. Finish the proposal, improve your health, help the customer, spend meaningful time with your child. Be specific about what you are actually trying to produce, because vague goals make it almost impossible to notice when your inputs have started working against them. If your goal is just do more, you will never have a reason to stop. Step 2. Identify the input. Hours, meetings, training, technology, advice, information, management, money. Whatever you are adding to get the result. The reason this step matters is that most people have a surprisingly unclear picture of what they are actually putting into a system. They know they are working hard. They are less clear on exactly which inputs are going up and by how much. Without that picture, you cannot see the curve. Step 3. Look for reversal. At what point does the input begin weakening the outcome? When does more exercise create injury instead of fitness? When does more research delay action instead of improving it? When does more communication interrupt work instead of coordinating it? When does earning for the family mean being absent from the family? Find the inflection point. And be honest here, because this is the step where most people stop. Because the inflection point is usually somewhere they already are or have already passed. Step 4. Establish a stopping rule in advance. Before you start, not after you are already exhausted. I will stop researching after 3 credible sources. Meetings end after 30 minutes unless a decision is imminent. No more than 3 major projects active at once. If the same problem requires a third corrective process, we reconsider the system itself. The rule needs to exist before the moment of temptation, not during it. Because in the moment, there is always a compelling reason to make an exception. The stopping rule is how you protect your future self from your present self's certainty that this particular situation is different. Step 5. Subtract before adding. When results deteriorate, resist the instinct to immediately add another intervention. First ask, what can be removed? What can be shortened? What can be allowed to recover? What complexity are you maintaining purely out of habit? Before assuming a struggling system needs more fuel, make sure it is not already flooded. This is the step that goes most directly against instinct, because addition feels like action and subtraction feels like giving up. But a system that is counterproductive does not need more input, it needs less. The courage to subtract is often harder to find than the energy to add, and it is almost always more useful. If you have made it this far, you probably recognize at least one place in your life where this is already happening. A meeting that has become its own full-time job, an app that now manages you, a habit that crossed from discipline into compulsion, a commitment that felt meaningful when you made it and now just feels heavy. That recognition is the first step. Assimilation into your life is the second. That is what this whole video has been building toward. Illich's law is not an excuse for laziness. It is a warning against effort that has become detached from observation. The difference between immature ambition and mature judgment is not how hard you work. It is whether you are watching what the work is actually producing. Whatever productive and convivial purpose institutions start with tends to get corrupted when they cross the threshold and begin optimizing for their own continuation rather than their original goal. That is true for organizations, and it is true for individuals. The habit that started as discipline, the schedule that started as ambition, the commitment that started as love, all of them can cross that same line if nobody is watching. There is no universal threshold, but there is always a threshold. And the most dangerous systems are not the ones that fail, obviously. They are the ones that keep expanding while producing increasingly sophisticated versions of failure. Listen to that again. The most dangerous systems keep growing while demanding increasingly sophisticated versions of failure. Every worthwhile activity has a point of enough. The wisdom is recognizing that point before exhaustion, bureaucracy, dependency, or reality recognizes it for you. So here is what I want you to do. Identify one counterproductive excess in your own life right now. A meeting that prevents work. A habit that has crossed the line. A form of help that no longer helps. An app that has become an obligation. Again, glaring at you iPhone. Drop it in the comments below. Not because sharing it fixes it, but because naming it clearly is usually the first step toward actually doing something about it. I read through comments on all the videos I create, and the conversations down there are often sharper than the video itself. If ideas like this help you see the hidden patterns shaping everyday life, I would be genuinely grateful if you subscribed, shared this with someone who needs it, or just stayed for the next one. Thanks for making it this far, and I hope you enjoyed watching this video as much as I had making it.